Hi everyone, the topic today will be aggregate planning, also known as intermediate planning. In this topic, we're going to talk about something we have touched upon previously in capacity management, which is how to manage capacity over the intermediate range time horizon, which are periods of 6 to 18 months. If you remember, in capacity management, we have said that over this time period, 6 to 18 months, is when we can make most of the decisions regarding capacity. We can decide both on how to modify existing capacity, we have enough time to do so, as well as how to use the existing capacity by setting up a production plan. That's because we have enough certainty, enough accuracy in forecasting to be able to set a production plan. So this will be the topic today. Before we look at the plan for today, I should mention that this chapter, aggregate planning, will not be covered by the final exam. That's because this chapter is about strategies. It's very qualitative, although we'll see quantitative tool at the end. But we cannot really cover the core of this chapter like this online. So this chapter is just for your information, for your edification as operations managers, but it will not be in the final exam. This task, aggregate planning, is typically performed by what we call sales and operations teams that see people from marketing provide input to people from operations. And these teams are going to sit around the table, collaborate, brainstorm to come up with an aggregate plan. So we'll describe the work of these sales and operations teams first, and then we'll look at what aggregate planning is and why it is important strategically. And then we'll get to the bulk of this chapter, which are the different strategies we can use for developing an aggregate plan. And so let's look at the work of these cross-functional teams in charge of aggregate planning. Let's first place aggregate planning within the bigger picture of all decisions made within an organization. We remember the 3 time horizons we have described in forecasting. Short term, which is a few days to a few weeks, up to 3 months. Intermediate range time horizon covers periods of 3 to 18 months. And then you have the long range time horizon, which is typically over 18 months, 3 to 5 years. Over the long range time horizon, we make strategic decisions. What makes them strategic is the fact that once we commit to a certain decision, it's very hard to adjust it over time. So it's important to get it right the first time. This type of decisions include the technology we invest in. We have seen how we can forecast technology with qualitative methods. The location of our production facilities, which country to invest in, etc. These are long-range planning type of decisions. On a day-to-day basis, you have the short-range time horizon, which covers periods of a few days to up to 3 months. And here, it's typically production supervisors, operations managers, or plant managers that are in charge of these decisions. It's about day-to-day planning of production, so scheduling the workloads of machines, the work shifts of employees, inventory management on a day-to-day basis, etc. And in between these 2 time horizons, we have what we have called the intermediate range time horizon, which covers periods of 3 to 18 months, in which, as we have seen, we have the most freedom regarding the decisions to make, because there's both enough time to adjust capacity, as well as enough precision and accuracy in forecasting to be able to plan production. Now, the reason we call intermediate planning aggregate planning is because this accuracy in forecasting is only possible, as we have seen, when you aggregate products in families. One of the first rules we give ourselves in forecasting is that it's much easier to forecast demand for aggregates of products rather than individual offerings, right? So here at the aggregate level, we make decisions about aggregates of products. And it's about defining a plan of production for these aggregates. For instance, all the smartphones offered by Samsung, without specifying which model we are talking about. We are going to plan the production of these smartphones according to the constraints that exist. One of them is, of course, capacity, and we'll see ways to adjust capacity according to our production plan. So it's about finding a match between the existing capacity and the options we have to modify it, and the production plan we have in sight in order to satisfy demand over the intermediate range time horizon. And so to perform this task and come up with an aggregate plan, we are going to take input from the marketing functional area, because the way we have defined it, we can expect marketing people to know best about demand, what customers want, the volumes of demand, etc. The starting point would be this input we get from marketing. We're going to forecast demand based on this input. And then the job of an aggregate plan would be to find a way to best meet this demand, to best satisfy it, in a way that accounts for the existing limitations within the organization, limitations of resources, capacity, what is financially feasible, etc. And so, contrary to most of the chapters we have seen so far, aggregate planning is more of an art than a science, because this aggregate plan, there is no formal way to establish it. It's really on a trial and error basis. We're going to consider different plans, see what works, what is feasible in terms of the limitations of resources. So it's going to be like a brainstorming exercise where we try to find the best match between existing resources and our production plan. Now, when we say that there is no formal quantitative method of aggregate planning, it does not mean that we are not going to use quantitative models. In fact, aggregate planning is going to make use of all the models we have seen in this course, all chapters, including the ones we haven't covered that are in the textbook, be it forecasting, as I've said, human resource management, supply chain management, inventory management, capacity management. All chapters, all strategic areas of decision-making and operations management will be made use of to come up with this aggregate plan. So we'll take this as an input and discuss it on a case-by-case basis, depending on the plans we are considering, so that we find the optimal match between our plan and existing resources. So in summary, the way to establish an aggregate plan would be to optimize each one of our strategic decisions, come up with a consistent plan that we hope optimizes resources given the constraints that exist on capacity, and then estimate the total cost of this plan and see if it matches our financial resources. And so the aggregate plan, which is the output we seek with this effort, would be a production plan over the intermediate range time horizon for aggregates of products. The goal of aggregate planning would be to satisfy demand in the best way possible while optimizing cost and resource usage over the intermediate range time horizon. And so in this chapter, we're going to see different adjustment variables that in and of themselves could be strategies for aggregate planning that we have access to in order to find this optimal match between a production plan that satisfies demand and the existing resources. Here is an example of an aggregate plan at BMW. You see that in the table for these 3 quarters, which is within the intermediate range time horizon, we simply mention the volume of products or vehicles in this case that will be produced. We don't specify whether these vehicles would be of 3 series, 5 series, or 7 series. That's for the reason we have seen in forecasting, which is that over this relatively long period of time of 3 to 18 months, we don't have any certainty regarding demand. We cannot get a very precise forecast. So one way to increase the accuracy of forecasting is to group products in aggregates or families of products like this. All sedan vehicles offered by BMW, that's an aggregate of several products. And if you look at the reason for this, and we have mentioned it in forecasting, it's that the factors that influence demand for BMW vehicles in general, without mention of the series we are talking about, well, these factors are rather stable. The number of people who can afford a BMW vehicle, that's a very stable number. People who have a certain level of employment, certain savings, this number is not likely to change drastically over the short-term time horizon. But whether people want 3 series or 5 series, whether they want this or that option, this or that color for the car, these aspects are of course much more volatile, right? They are likely to be influenced by trends and to change a lot over the short-term time horizon. So we discard these aspects that we cannot really forecast and only focus on the deep and stable factors that we hope to capture with our aggregate forecast of demand. And so the main thing we focus on in this chapter are the variables that we can adjust in order to come up with an aggregate plan. We call them aggregate planning strategies because each one of these variables in and of itself could be used as a strategy to establish an aggregate plan, or we can also combine these variables. Now that we have understood the goal of aggregate planning, we can state the problem very clearly. Look at this graph, take a good look at it. The difficulty of aggregate planning is that we have demand on the one hand, or forecasts of it, which as we know are unstable, seasonal, so demand varies over time. And on the other hand, we have capacity, which is rather stable over the intermediate range time horizon. We can adjust it slightly and we'll see how to do so. But by nature, by design, capacity is more stable than demand. And so if our goal is to establish a production plan that satisfies demand at the cheapest possible cost, we need to specify how to bridge the gap between capacity and demand. And so the strategies we see in this chapter, which are really the core of this chapter, do just that. They specify ways in which we can bridge the gap between a rather stable capacity, which defines our production volume, and a fluctuating or seasonal demand. Now, one thing you should keep in mind, and we have said it from the very first chapter, is that when we study operations management in this course, we do it from as generic as possible a perspective, meaning that we are not interested in any specific sector or market or industry. And so what we see here applies theoretically to both the service and manufacturing sectors and any market within each sector. So you cannot expect all the strategies we are going to see to be applicable to any sector. We are going to mention all possible adjustment variables to come up with an aggregate plan, but some of them would be more relevant to some sectors than others. For instance, we'll mention inventory as a possible way to bridge the gap between capacity and demand. Well, inventory by design wouldn't apply to the service sector. So coming up with an aggregate plan is about finding the right fit between our aggregate planning strategy and the existing circumstances. We are going to study 8 adjustment variables to come up with an aggregate plan, which in and of themselves could be used as strategies, pure strategies, or they can be combined to come up with a more sophisticated strategy. These 8 adjustment variables, or 8 strategies for aggregate planning, can be classified in one of 2 categories. We have what we call capacity options, which act on capacity. Capacity options are going to adjust the red line, the line for capacity, to make it more like demand. And we have a second category of strategies that we call demand option. Here, we do the opposite. We act on demand to make it more stable, more like the capacity line. And so let's look at capacity options first. Remember that the goal here is to find a way in our aggregate plan to make the blue line meet the red line, to make capacity meet demand. Well, a very simple adjustment variable we can use to bridge this gap would be inventory. It's very commonly used in manufacturing. So if we use inventory as an adjustment variable, we are simply going to produce at a rather constant rate. We'll have a stable amount of production and simply store whatever surplus we have if demand is lower than our production. And for future periods, when demand gets higher than our capacity, we'll simply rely on our existing inventory to bridge the gap. Now, as we know from the chapter on inventory management, there is a downside to relying on inventory too much. It's that inventory has a cost, the cost of managing it, the cost of holding, carrying, etc. Inventory is also risky because most quality defects appear during storage. And there's also a risk of a shortage if we estimate our production plan. If it's not enough to fulfill demand in any case, we're going to face a shortage And as we know, that could be disastrous for corporate reputation and it could harm future sales. But inventory, of course, remains a very important adjustment variable, and it's the main one in manufacturing. Second adjustment variable of the capacity variety. Here again, we are not acting on demand to make it more stable, but doing the opposite, acting on capacity to make it follow demand. We can also rely on varying the size of our workforce. This is mainly used in the service sector. So you may adjust the size of the workforce, which represents the main component of capacity in the service sector. Most of the capacity comes from people, not from equipment and machines in the service sector. So that would be the main adjustment variable. And you would find, for instance, that hotels, restaurants, etc., would hire employees in the high season when demand is high, and then simply lay off this workforce when it's not needed anymore, when demand decreases. And here we make our capacity follow demand. Now, the downsides of this strategy is that it should be only reserved for low-skilled type of positions, because you simply wouldn't have time to invest in workers, to retain them, manage their skills. So you typically find that this type of approach is used, for instance, for receptionist positions in hotels, waiters in restaurants, etc. And there's another possible downside that we have seen in chapter 2, when we talked about, it was chapter 1, sorry, when we talked about the productivity variable, what influences productivity. We have said that the well-being of employees was a very important such variable. And so here, if you are constantly hiring and firing employees, the remaining employees may feel threatened in their employment. And so that wouldn't be great for the working atmosphere and for their productivity. But varying the size of the workforce remains, of course, a very important option in the service sector. Another capacity option we have is to use varying production rate, meaning that whenever demand is low, we don't have to fully use our capacity and we can produce at a lower rate than the full effective capacity we have access to. This has several possible disadvantages. The first one is that since you are using your production facility at a lower than capacity rate, you need to manage idle time. And idle time is not an easy thing to manage, meaning that equipment would need maintenance, employees would need to be assigned different tasks, for instance, maintenance tasks. You can see this, for instance, in 7-Eleven outlets. Whenever they don't have many customers in the store, they assign supply chain work or inventory work or maintenance work to their employees. And you would find the 7-Eleven people cleaning, maintaining inventory, etc. So this is one difficulty in managing this type of strategy. And the second one is that for some manufacturing facilities, the facility would be optimally set up for a certain fixed production rate. And so constantly changing the production rate may impact the quality of the output. Fourth capacity option, and we have seen this in depth in chapter 2, is to use subcontracting or outsourcing. Whenever our capacity is lower than demand, we can simply pay someone else to temporarily add to our capacity. So they would be in charge of some of our production for us. And that would be one way to make capacity meet demand. Now, as we have seen with our study of subcontracting in chapter 2, this has several possible pitfalls. One of them is loss of control over the quality, delays of the output. And another one is that you expose your customers to a possible competitor, and this may harm you down the line. That's the main, in fact, the main disadvantage of outsourcing is that you may create future competition and give away trade secrets. Last capacity option, which is very commonly used in the service sector, but also in manufacturing, is to simply rely on part-time work. You would hire part-time employees for periods where demand is higher than average, high seasons, and that would be one way to temporarily add to your production capacity. Now, one thing to be wary of is that this strategy, part-time work, should be reserved for low-skilled positions. You are not going to hire part-time engineers, for instance, but you would find that for part-time service jobs, waiters, receptionists, or part-time construction jobs, this could be very useful. This is simply because we wouldn't have the time and resources to invest in managing the skills of these part-time workers. So the difficulty here is about finding the right positions to fulfill with part-time work at the right time. Now, a second type of adjustment variables, which again, in and of themselves could be aggregate planning strategies, are what we call demand options. Here, as opposed to what we have done so far with the capacity options, we are instead going to act on demand to make it more stable and more like our stable capacity. This is what you learn about in marketing. In fact, the whole area of advertising, promotions, special deals aim at doing just that. They aim at taking some of the demand from the high season and moving it to periods where we have lower seasons so that demand overall could be more stable and more like our capacity. Here is an example of it with this Disney deal. So for Disney, an important component of capacity would be the investments they make in acquiring their facilities, their theme parks, their castles, etc. Once this investment is made, we seek to have the best possible utilization rate of it. And so for Disney, an obvious low season would be the school period when kids are at school. But they have found that for preschool children, younger school children, going to the theme park could be considered part of their coursework, right? Could be considered part of their schoolwork. And so they target preschool children with these promotions called preschool years, where they try to take away some of the demand from the high season that includes both preschool and older kids, and instead move it to the lower season, which is the school season for them. Now, an obvious limitation of this type of strategies is that we are acting on something external. We're acting on demand, customers, the market, and this is never certain to work. It's never certain to be enough to stabilize demand, as opposed to the capacity options we have seen so far, which simply acted on the decisions we make internally. So there would be more uncertainty with this type of options. Another capacity option, which in and of itself, again, could be an aggregate planning strategy, is what we call back ordering. What is back ordering? It's whenever demand is too high to make customers wait some period of time before receiving their orders. This could be a few seconds to a few minutes. For instance, when you wait in line at the coffee shop, when the coffee shop is under capacity, they would make you wait some amount of time. It could be a few weeks to a few months. For instance, in cars dealerships, whenever they don't have your car, they would make you wait that amount of time to receive it. Or it can take up to a few years. For some brands that have very good corporate reputation, such as luxury brand Hermes, they can make their customers wait as long as 2 years to receive their bags. That's because, again, customers are willing to wait. And this is, in fact, the main risk with this strategy. It's that, in some cases, customers may simply not be willing to wait and accept back ordering. It's a rather forceful way to stabilize demand. We are literally forcing some of the demand from the high season and pushing it to the low season, and customers may not accept that. Back ordering, the willingness of customers to accept it, is in fact highly tied with the corporate reputation of the company. So the higher and better the corporate reputation, the more willing customers would be to follow you with this aggregate planning strategy. The last demand option for aggregate planning, this one is quite creative and interesting. It's what we call counter-seasonal offerings. Remember that we are talking about planning production for aggregates of products. So a counter-seasonal product or offering would mean including a new product in the mix, in the aggregate, that would have a seasonal structure that goes opposite to your existing products. For instance, we have this example with Oakley in the slide. Oakley initially offered winter sports products, and so their demand was highly seasonal. It was high during winter season and low otherwise. Oakley used counter-seasonal product offering by including new products, which are summer sports, surf, boards, sunglasses, shorts, etc. These products would have the opposite demand structure as existing products, which were up to some point just winter sport products. So overall, by including these new products with the opposite seasonality, you would have a stable demand at the aggregate level. What a counter-seasonal offering is not, it's not a seasonal promotion or deal on existing products. Here we are speaking of entering a new market, offering a new product, simply because it would compensate the decrease in demand in our existing products. And this is also the risk with counter-seasonal offerings. It's that by entering a new market in which we don't have an established reputation and experience, it's always risky and it may not work out. But this remains an interesting and creative demand option to establish an aggregate plan. And it's also softer than the variable we have seen previously, which is back ordering. What we have seen so far are 8 adjustment variables that may allow us to make production meet demand. As I've said, these could be used as pure strategies, or they could be combined, for instance, using both inventory and influencing demand as a way to establish an aggregate plan. Now, when it comes to combining these 8 options, we can also follow templates. And there happens to be 2 main templates to come up with a mixed strategy combining these 8 variables. We call them chase strategy versus a level strategy. With a chase strategy, we are going to chase demand with our production. So we leave demand as is, seasonal and unstable, and we try to adjust our production rate to make it meet demand. This is useful in many contexts, for instance, when we cannot use inventory, such as the service sector. In the service sector, you can simply not store hotel nights or taxi rides, so you have to adjust your capacity to the variations of demand. And so we're going to combine some of the variables we have seen previously. For instance, we're going to vary the size of our workforce, adjust the production rate in manufacturing, etc. You typically find this strategy used in the service sector for the reason I have specified, which is that we cannot rely on inventory. But there are exceptions. The exception here of manufacturing context in which a chase strategy makes sense is what we have called a just-in-time production approach. Producing just-in-time is precisely applying a chase strategy in manufacturing. And the second mixed strategy that combines the options we have seen so far is what we call a level strategy. With a level strategy, level means stable. We are going to keep our production level, stable, and use the options we have seen to make it meet demand. For instance, we are going to rely on inventory. We are going to try to influence demand to stabilize it with counter-seasonal offerings, with promotions, etc. This is typically good because in manufacturing, as you have said, manufacturing facilities are typically optimal for a certain setting. So it's not good to constantly change the production rate and make adjustments. This is also good for the workforce, obviously, because your workforce can expect stable employment and that would typically keep them happy and productive. So this is the best, it looks at least like the best choice in manufacturing, but some service providers also use a level strategy. And here the main type of services that use a level strategy would be public services. That's because public servants expect stable employment. That's one of the main perks of working for the government, right? And so public services typically keep their production and capacity level stable, and they rely heavily on back ordering, isn't it? So when you go to public services, you can typically expect to wait in line, and you are usually forced to do so because public services are also typically monopolies. That's the main strategy in the public services. But in general, we can say that a level strategy makes more sense in manufacturing than in the service sectors, except for this example. So that's it for this very brief chapter. Next week, we are mostly going to focus on the final exam. I'll try to put some practice exam online and find a way to explain it on Tuesday, and then Wednesday we'll have our final exam. That would be on e-learning. So we'll upload the questions, and you will have 2 hours to upload your answers. It will be all online. Please let me know if you cannot make it. If for one reason or the other you cannot be there on the 1st April from 6 to 8 p.m., we'll try to find some arrangements. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you soon.